Less than 14% of the nearly 400,000 immigrants arrested by ICE since President Trump returned to office a year ago have been charged with or convicted of violent criminal offenses. That is according to official statistics contained in a DHS document obtained by CBS News. Joining us, MS Now senior national and political reporter Jacob Soboroff. Also with us, NYU law professor and MS Now legal analyst Melissa Murray. Let's talk about the stats here. 14% had convictions, fewer than 14% had convictions for violent crime.
And on top of that, less than 2%, this is great reporting by CBS, less than 2% of those arrested by ICE over the past year had homicide or sexual assault charges or convictions. Less than 2% of 400,000. Another 2% of those taken into ICE custody were accused of being gang members. The larger picture is what we have seen anecdotally over and over and over again. They are not going after the worst of the worst, and you cannot institute the largest mass deportation program by going after only the worst of the worst.
There are not that many of the quote-unquote worst of the worst to go after, that if you want to do mass deportations, if you want to exceed the number of deportations that President Obama did, if you want 1 million people a year, that you're going to have to get people who are not violent criminals. Of course. It's just part of the issue.
Of course. And in fact, many of these states, Gavin Newsom, when I spent time with him, and Tim Walz also made it a specific point to let me know that they do cooperate from their state prison systems by handing the so-called worst of the worst over to ICE and to the federal government. And it's the county and the city jails that the federal government is trying to go into to get people maybe that don't even have convictions, might even be pre-trial for misdemeanor offenses.
It's confusing because on the one hand, you have deport them now, mass deportations now, which was at on the placards of the RNC. But you also have the president of the United States saying we need to go at this with heart. He's talking about people who have been here for 10 or 20 years, how they deserve to be here. He mentioned to the New York Times comprehensive immigration reform. So he seems to be saying one thing, signaling to certain people out there that it's only the bad people that we want to get out, not everybody else. But the actions of this administration are speaking to another hardline version of the MAGA base who wants to get every undocumented immigrant out of this country.
Bingo. And it reminds me of a moment that I will never forget, which is in my film with Errol Morris about family separation, when Donald Trump is sitting there signing an executive order to stop the family separation policy in late June of 2018, stopping a policy that he himself and the woman over his shoulder, Kirstjen Nielsen, put into place with her own signature just months before.
So we have an echo of that today, and this is reporting from ProPublica. Again, ProPublica, which released those haunting and horrifying audio of the children who had been separated from their parents crying during the first administration.
Ginger Thompson at the time released.
So they have new reporting, and this is letters from kids who are being held in Dilley, Texas, the same detention center that Liam Conejo Ramos was held at. What did these letters say? More
extraordinary reporting by Michael Rosenberg here. And I want to just read some of the letters. Again, it gets to the point you can't have mass deportation without locking up not just nonviolent people, but children as well. Dilley has been a family detention center in this country in Democratic and Republican administrations. It was closed down during the last one. It's now reopened. Before, most of the kids that were there had been apprehended crossing the border. Now many kids are there being taken from the interior, out of their own day-to-day lives, going to school, speaking perfect English. Here's one letter. I miss my school and my friends. I feel bad since when I came here to this place because I have been here too long. This is a 9-year-old detained for over 50 days. Here's another letter. I have never been separated from my siblings, and it's honestly sad because they were little and they need their mom and their sister, and that's Ariana, whose U.S. citizen siblings are 2 and 5 years old. She's been detained for 45 days.
She's just 14 herself.
These stories they will rip your heart out of your chest when you read them, and it is impossible to think anything other than these aren't the worst of the worst. You don't have to think very hard. You don't have to read for very long. Go listen to the audio. It's some of the most extraordinary reporting I've seen in the second Trump term about who is actually being detained in all of this.
And you've seen no moves by the Trump administration toward comprehensive immigration reform, toward a pathway for citizenship if they would want it, nothing beyond just deport as many as we possibly can.
And not only that, they're looking at opening more detention centers that would house families.
Melissa, there's also the issue of trying to go through with all of these investigations, these prosecutions in Minnesota. What's happened in Minnesota and in Minneapolis has caused a wave of resignations in that state. The top ICE lawyer in Minnesota has departed as immigration lawsuits overwhelm the courts. We've also seen reporting, Melissa, that because there are so few prosecutors, the federal government has had to bring in JAGs.
It's all, again, this is a real crisis within the Department of Justice, people becoming demoralized and leaving. If I could just take one beat on something that Jacob just said with regard to that CBS News reporting, it also shows that a very small number of those detained are members of gangs, which is something the administration has touted over and over again and has been the basis for the administration's invocation of really extraordinary federal interventions like the use of the Alien Enemies Act to expel individuals from this country to foreign countries and to foreign prisons. So again, just the underlying statistical evidence and foundation for this immigration program seems to be really shaky. With regard to what's happening at DOJ, we are seeing record numbers of career officials leaving the Department of Justice. And that's a real problem, not just in terms of immigration enforcement and the kind of backlog that we're seeing increasing. It was already backlogged. It's becoming even more backlogged. But it also has real consequences for DOJ's ability to address other kinds of crimes or other kinds of investigations in those areas. So, for example, in Minnesota, the U.S. Attorney's Office was not just handling ICE enforcement in those kinds of cases. They were also dealing with a massive fraud investigation. That's going to be very hard to continue to address if, in fact, the people leading that investigation have left, which is the case. So this is sort of a broader question of what's happening in the Department of Justice and losing people who are career prosecutors with real expertise.
Melissa, is it fixable? Can you get those people back?
It can be fixed. I don't know that a lot of people are going to be coming back in droves. And I think the real question isn't about fixing it, but what will replace it? So if you follow those who study the way democracies slide into autocracies, one of the things they note that is in administrative agencies like the DOJ, for example, when career people leave because they can no longer abide what is happening, that's a perfect opportunity for those who are loyal to the regime to burrow in and really become entrenched. So the question isn't whether there's a quick fix, but what will happen going forward to make sure that this isn't just an arm of a broader, more autocratic and oppressive regime.
So on this subject, just briefly to end this, on the subject of the messaging from the Trump administration about what they were going to do regarding immigration when Donald Trump was running a second time, he had two very different messages. One of them was mass deportation now, again, as Jacob and I saw at the RNC. But the other one was, as Melissa was pointing out, we're going to get all the gang members out. We're going to get all the criminals out. And those two messages went to two different sets of people. One that want hardline immigration reform or just the border being shut down and all of the immigrants out. They want them gone for economic reasons or for other reasons. And the other one was to people who were on the fence, who were scared and nervous about crime and who were nervous about what they were seeing online, the messaging coming out of the administration. The Daily from the New York Times has an incredible podcast today about those two different sets of Trump voters and how they feel about what has been happening in this country over the past few weeks, couple months. It is definitely worth a listen, and I recommend everybody take one when they have the time. All right, Jacob Soboroff, Melissa Murray, thank you.